Hi everyone. In this video I want to give those of you that do not regularly read academic papers brief introduction to how you want to approach that and how do you want to be effective in reading management papers. And I do this because it's quite important skill to have because a lot of the more interesting and contemporary knowledge is really contained in those management papers and not in textbooks or wherever. So I have the following three goals here with that video to help you on the one hand understand that there are different types of management papers that you find, especially four types that might be quite useful. They distinguish themselves in the structure and the types of sections, content sections they have, and in being a bit more knowledgeable about that and understanding where to read specifically. I hope that saves you some time and allows you to understand the content, the contribution of a paper within, let's say, about half an hour. And then look, is it worth taking another look? Is it sufficient here, or is that paper nothing for me of interest and I discard it in the future, which might also be quite helpful once you start on your thesis, master's thesis research, for example, for those of you that still have a thesis to write. So let's go here into medias res, and I want to start with the data-driven, with the empirical papers. There are basically two types of empirical papers that you will find. On the one hand, empirical quantitative, and then on the other hand, empirical qualitative data. And as you can see here, the big difference in both is both the purpose, what you can achieve with them, and the type of data you're using, right? So quantitative data, obviously more of numerical values, large data sets, and you essentially use that in order to test theories, right? To find correlations between variables and test relationships. Qualitative data is usually much larger, much smaller data sets, but much more rich data sources, lots of textual data that come from different sources, interviews, video material, and so forth. And we use this data to identify patterns and to build new theory or elaborate existing theory toward more detail level, for example, about processes, how something happens over time. So that's the big differentiation in the set of empirical papers. And then we have a set of two types of papers that are maybe less empirical. Number one here, that's a theoretical or conceptual paper where authors try to insert into the literature a new claim, like a new theory. And they do that without data usually. Maybe sometimes they use a bit of cases to highlight examples, or they use agent-based modeling to on artificial data sources, if you will, to demonstrate effects in their theory. But usually it's verbal reasoning. They make claims and they make good persuasive arguments. Sometimes they also model. They do mathematical modeling to show boundary conditions of an argument or so forth, but we will find examples later in this course of that. And then the other type of paper you might find is a literature overview that basically summarizes the state of the art, what is out there, what exists in prior knowledge, and there the input is obviously not data, or the data that you put in is prior papers or prior research, and they offer you a structured overview of what prior work has done, where areas are covered and what areas are not covered. So that helps you getting a good overview what is already known versus what is not known. So these four types of papers are very important to distinguish, because that will help you to understand a bit, okay, where in that paper is actually the novelty and what can I get out of that particular type of paper. And you see here in that structural overview type is that all papers, essentially, all management papers have some commonalities and some differences. So the commonalities is essentially that they all come in a sandwich structure. Almost every management paper will have a decent introduction, and there's somewhere at the end a conclusion or implications discussion. What really does this add to the literature? What is the final conclusion out of this? So this sandwich is basically the middle part. And then there are differences in that middle part. Many papers will, right after the introduction, offer you a brief snapshot of the background, so what has been studied before, what do we know already, or what have prior research papers said about topics that are important for the particular research question that we want to study. The empirical papers usually will tell you, okay, so how did we measure stuff? Where is our data coming from? What's our sampling approach? And then they go really into the actual novel contribution of their paper, which would be either the empirical results from their statistical analysis on the part of empirical quantitative data, or they develop an outline in much detail, case data, quotes from their respondents, and they often developed in a big model, like you see these big figures with concepts linked with arrows. They're process models that come out of that. So that all happens usually in a portion or a section of a paper that is called findings or / implications. The conceptual papers, they usually also give you a bit of a literature background, but obviously because there's no data, they don't need to tell you where they sample and what method they use. They just start then usually with a big introduction of what their theory is and what are the different building blocks and how does it all come together. And then the literature overview papers, similarly, they don't need to, like, the whole purpose of a literature is basically to offer a literature background. So that's the main purpose, that's the body of that paper. And up front, they usually tell you, okay, how did we select actually the prior works and the prior papers that got into our paper? So that's the basic foundation of how papers are structured, and I want to deep dive a bit more into two versions of these, how you might want to actually read them. The quantitative on the one hand, and if you listen carefully then you also know a bit how to read the qualitative one, and the conceptual one. So let's start here with the quantitative version. So you know, everyone starts with an introduction. You have the literature background, data, method, results, then the big findings part usually, and the contribution and conclusion. And what you want to do, and let me maybe move my picture here a little bit down so you see something on the slide. So you really want to read quite carefully the introduction of a paper. A good introduction always sets you up by offering, okay, this is what we want to study, this is what we know, this is what we don't know, we think there's a complication, and we have the following research question. So you should always carefully read the introduction to understand what conversation does this paper add to, what do we know, what we don't know, and what is the actual research question I want to study in this paper. Then you have all the literature background and the methodology section, and you typically want to skip most parts of that probably, although for many of you who have not read that much academic literature, some of the literature background parts might be quite new for you because you haven't read that, but that is not actually the contribution of that particular paper, right? That just summarizes what we know already. So you should be able to skip most of those. What you can do in a quantitative paper, usually you have hypotheses in that part. So they use the prior literature to derive hypotheses they then want to test with their new data set they collected. So what you want to do is you want to look out where the hypotheses, they're usually easy to spot because they're formatted separately, they're indent and italics or whatever. So you find them quite easily. So find them, read them. If they have face validity, great. If you think, that's an interesting hypothesis, I don't know if I trust that, well, you want to read probably the paragraph on top of that to understand, that's why they proposed this, fine. But you can skim read that. You also want to probably skip most of the data and method part. What you might want to, if it's interest and if it's relevant for you, you might want to briefly check, okay, what data did they collect? Did they really collect reasonable data that allows them to study what they want to study, and how did they operationalize important variables, right? So if you want to study entrepreneurial performance, for example, it is a big difference whether you operationalize entrepreneurial performance as, okay, venture capital raised versus revenue gathered from customers, employees hired, right? These are very different growth or performance measures. So that's quite important to understand, and sometimes you want to check that. But these parts typically you skim. Also the results section, that is often big tables and all the statistics. And if you're a statistic geek, that might be of interest to you. Most normal people tend to skim that, and it's fine in our case also to do that, because usually I select papers that have been published in really, really good, high-quality journals, so we trust a little bit that there have been knowledgeable reviewers that have looked already at the data and method and found that very valuable and valid and reliable. So we trust that, and what you then really want to do is move over and read in much more detail and with attention here the findings and the implications, because typically in that section what the authors take, they take their statistical results and they translate and interpret that in normal language for us and help us understand, okay, what does that mean? You know, did we find a correlation or a statistical relationship between input variable and output variable? To what degree? What is the magnitude of the effect, and so forth? And usually in that section they tell you that in nice words, and that is really the outcome and conclusion of the paper and the response to the question that was raised up front. If you're at that stage happy, you think you know what the paper is, fine, you're done. I often tend to also briefly check the conclusion to make sure is it really, did I really get it? The conclusion often has a nice, if it's done well, has a good summary of the key messages. So depending on how much time you have, also go and check out the contribution and conclusion. But that's not the most important part anymore, right? The most important part should be, what do we study? How did we study it? Check a little bit the method, and then read in detail the findings, this description. Then reading theory papers is a little bit more tricky, I think. But again, you will start with the introduction. You try to understand, okay, what is the puzzle? What is not known? Why do we need to create a new theory here? What is the question that we hope to respond to with that theory? You skip again the literature background, because that only tells what has been done before. And you want to read the theory development part then with a very, probably a smart approach of identifying or learning how to identify the code words that introduce the important paragraphs, right? Paragraphs where they really summarize things like, okay, we propose, based on the theory X, Y, and Z, we think it is important in the future to study how entrepreneurs do X, Y, and Z. Or we propose the following: more successful entrepreneurs will select their teams on a mix of instrumental and social variables, something like that. So try to understand where the paragraphs, where the authors state their claim, right? What is the claim they are making? That is important. And I often personally tend to skip all the modeling parts. Some authors, have interesting mathematical models that if there are trade-off decisions, for example, if they say, look, under what conditions do I experiment, for example? How much information do I need to gather? And then they have important models, mathematical models to model that. I tend to skip that, and I try to find those paragraphs where they summarize, okay, our model reveals that you should only experiment when the cost of the experiment are much lower than the negative externalities you create by revealing, or something like that. So if that is written somewhere, that helps you understand what is their theory, what do they propose, what do they want to insert here as an important claim. So that is quite important. Sometimes there are interesting figures or graphs, so it's always good to take an in-depth look at the figure or graph, because that gives you an impression of what are the key constructs they want to link, and what is the relationship between these key constructs. So well done figures and graphs should help you understand quite a bit what the theory of the paper is. And again, also read or try to understand what is the structure of their theory section. Usually there are subheadings, substructures, and that gives you an indication of what are the building blocks, what are key concepts they are trying to discuss here. And then at the end of that section, you should usually have a good understanding what is the novel claim that an author makes. And if you still have time and you want to read, you probably want to read the implications and contributions. Usually for you, I would check out, is there an implications for practice? section in there that might be quite interesting, because then academics usually try to interpret their claims and their arguments they made and try to tell us, okay, why do we need to care in the practice of entrepreneurship or in the practice of managing about that? So that could be quite interesting for you. All right. So having done that, you should at the end of a paper really be able to answer a number of key questions. And that is the very first one. You should be able to answer what is the main research question of that paper, or what is the puzzle, right, to what the authors want to contribute to. That's important. You also want to be able to understand, it's here the third bullet point, what method did they use? Maybe even have a judgment, is it any good? But in this class, we usually don't go so far. That is more for PhD classes. And then what is the key finding? What does the paper either find or disproved, or what is a new claim what the authors make? So that's important. And what does that mean going forward? Right? These are the key things. And then sometimes you see here, sometimes maybe you also understand, okay, there's a core new concept, a core theory. The authors think we shouldn't think about entrepreneurship as an economic activity, but more as a social activity or something like that. So you want to try to understand where the author's coming from. What is their main perspective they take when they look at the managerial problem or at the entrepreneurial problem. But the key thing really is research question, method used, key insight, key finding, key contribution they make with that paper. So with that, I think if you're able to do that, and if you understand a bit how these papers differ, that should really enable you, I hope at least, to go much faster through reading a paper, and within, I say, anywhere 20 minutes to maybe 40 minutes, really have understood and checked an academic paper. With that, I would say we see each other in one of our next sessions. Thank you very much, and have a good rest of the day. Bye-bye.